Hello, and welcome to our filmed picnic in the WORLDwrite Centre garden. I'm Luca Moretto, and today we're going to be talking about sovereignty. The questions about national sovereignty raised by the invasion of Ukraine, the impacts on individual sovereignty brought about by COVID restrictions, and much more. I'm delighted to be joined by all of our volunteers, and particularly our special guests. Ella Whelan, a spiked columnist and organiser of the Battle of Ideas Festival. John Holbrook, a barrister with a long-standing interest in politics and law. And Lada Velikova, who's come from Ukraine and is currently working as an intern with WORLDwrite. John, do you want to get us started with some ideas?
Well, thank you, Luca, and hello, everybody. And I'm going to be talking about national sovereignty and looking in terms of what that means and why it's a very important organising principle for the way that nations both organise themselves internally and relate to one another. Now, there's about 8 billion people in the world, and we're all members, citizens, if you like, of it's about 195 different nations. And each of those 195 nations is a sovereign state. And what we mean by that is really that each of those states has two principles. One is that it is entitled to make its own laws. In other words, it's an autonomous, self-governing body of people. And the other is, and this is a consequence of that, is that it's enabled to relate to other nations in an independent, sovereign way. So essentially, they are the two hallmarks of a sovereign nation, namely that they can make their own laws and they govern themselves, and they also decide how they're going to relate to other nations in the world. Now, I think that's a very important principle, and I say that because, first of all, I think as a matter of practical necessity, it's necessary to have a unit like a sovereign nation state. I mean, with 8 billion people in the world, you need to have units that can organise themselves and relate to each other. And doing it on a national basis is as good a means as any. And indeed, I think in the modern world, it's probably the only successful way of doing it. But it's not just the sort of practical need for a sovereign nation, which I think is important. I also think, as a matter of principle, we need to recognise the importance of sovereignty. I think it's important because if we have sovereign nations, then there's a greater chance of there being world peace. Because if we accept the right of any individual nation to exist as a sovereign state, then we also ought to expect the right of other nations to exist as sovereign states. Now, there can never be any guarantee of peace, but it seems to me that that's an important organising principle which will facilitate peace, because unless you have a nation which is full of hypocrisy, and of course we know that these nations do exist, then any sovereign nation ought to respect the sovereignty and the independence and the right to exist of every other nation. So it's important in that organisational sense, in the way that nations relate to one another. But I also think that sovereignty is important as well for helping there to be some sort of national peace. And what I mean by that is that although in the stable countries, particularly Western nations, we perhaps tend to take it for granted that there will always be internal peace. But historically, that's not been the case. And it's very easy for nations to fragment. One of the ways in which I think they can help overcome this tendency to fragment is by seeing that their own nation is important, and by fostering a sense of national collective identity. And so if you have a state, a nation, which is organised on that principle, then I think it encourages it to actually think about how it can best organise itself for the good of all its citizens. So for those two reasons, I think sovereignty is very important. Now, maybe what I've been saying isn't seen as particularly controversial, but the interesting thing is, over the last 50 years or so, I think the notion of a sovereign state has rather gone out of fashion. And when I was thinking about this talk, the words of a pop star, John Lennon, came to mind. Now, John Lennon, of course, was one of the Beatles until they folded, and he had a solo career, and he wrote this song in 1971, so what, more than 50 years ago, and it was called Imagine. And I just want to read to you the first verse. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to sing it, but I just want to read the first verse. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Now, that in some ways has become, I won't say an organising principle, but it's become a very popular principle. This notion that nations are bad, nations are not good for peace, and that they are themselves, the very notion of sovereignty is inclined to cause disharmony and war. And I think it's utter nonsense. I mean, you only have to begin with the first sentence. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Really? I mean, I can't imagine a world without, us saying this is Britain or that's France or there's India or wherever. It's a sort of imagination you might have when you've been smoking too much pot, which possibly is something that John Lennon had been doing. But his concluding sentence as well, imagine all the people living life in peace. I can't see it. It really is a fantasy world that I think John Lennon was dreaming of. But fantasy or not, there have been challenges to the notion of sovereignty that have been very prevalent in the way that we organise world affairs over the last 50 years. And that's really the notion of supranationalism. The idea that because nations are bad, it's better to have some supranational organisation. In other words, you weaken the sovereignty of nations and you hand over powers to these supranational organisations. And there are many I could name. Perhaps the most obvious one in Britain is the European Union, because of course we've had Brexit, and that was motivated very much by a desire for Britain to regain its sovereignty and take it back from the EU. But there are other organisations, whether it's the World Trade Organization or the European Convention on Human Rights, which is another one that keeps coming into the news, particularly with the government's attempts with its Rwanda immigration policy. And there you have European judges. No one knows who they are or what they do or why they're there, but they seem to have inordinate powers to curtail the ability of this nation to decide on its own affairs. So there's that challenge to sovereignty. And then just very briefly, there's also, because remember I spoke about the way in which the sovereign nation encourages it to have some sort of unity within its own territory. I think that has been challenged by the notion of multiculturalism, which we tend to call diversity these days. Now, no one is against having a diverse society. It all depends what you mean by diversity. But I think the problem with multiculturalism, as it's been promoted over the last 50 years, is that it celebrates and promotes difference. Whereas in fact, to have a harmonious nation, it is very much necessary to have a set of core values and norms that everybody can sign up to. And if you have those two things, you have sovereignty both as against the way a nation relates to others, and sovereignty both internally in terms of the way that the state relates to its own people, then I think that is the best guarantee that we can have for peace.
Thank you, John. Now I'll be handing over to Lada.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lada, but the long version of it is Whelan, which started appearing during the popularity of Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet and consequently post-Soviet culture. This should be enough to roughly understand the situation of cultural sovereignty in Ukraine back when I was a child. Our culture and language were almost erased. The Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine was signed in 1990. These were the years of the collapse of the USSR. Ethnic tensions in the Asian and Caucasian republics erupted into bloody battles. At the time, a survey was conducted in Ukraine, and 80% agreed to be a part of sovereign republics based on the document on the sovereignty of Ukraine. The Verkhovna Rada of the Ukraine SSR in those moments declares the sovereignty of Ukraine as supremacy, independence, completeness, and indivisibility of the power of the republic within its territory, independence, and equality in external relations. Ukraine's struggle for sovereignty is inspiring because we were under occupation for a long time. From 1917 to 1991, Ukraine was under Soviet occupation. It was a military, political, and cultural process of land seizure by the Soviet Union. In 1941, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union and occupied Ukraine. The USSR recaptured all territories and until 1991 carried out annexation occupation. Even after receiving the official documents on sovereignty, Ukraine was not left alone. In 2030, President Yanukovych's pro-Russian policy brought the country to the brink of crisis. Active students came out for a peaceful protest, but were violently suppressed. In 2014, thanks to Yanukovych's government, Russian troops equipment, and people were already on the territory of Donbass and took Ukrainian military units under protection. Local authorities under the control of Russia held an illegal referendum on the extension of Donbass to the territory of the Russian Federation. Novorossiya, it's New Russia. That's what they called our territories. Then, as in 1917, the Ukrainian side began an anti-terrorist operation in the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk in order to expel the enemy from their sovereign land. After 24th February, we understood that the struggle for sovereignty continues. Here, in WORLDwrite's garden, it's nice that we can talk about sovereignty not like citizen of the world, but like citizen of their own countries. People have traditionally forgotten about rights which were solid for a long time. Erasing sovereignty of particular state will lead to war, so we need to talk about sovereignty before the war come to the West.
Thank you, Lada. Now over to Ella.
Well, thank you, WorldWrite, and everyone for having me here to talk about this very pertinent but also exciting thing, sovereignty. And we've heard discussion about national sovereignty, about the fight for sovereignty. And what I really wanted to focus on was the idea of popular sovereignty and how that plays out in terms of how people engage in politics, but also how people take control of their own lives. And the thing that I think you have to understand about sovereignty, first and foremost, is that it's not a destination. It's not a policy that a government can enact. It's not a goal that you can sort of immediately achieve and then sit back on your backside and relax. It's an active thing. It's actually a thing that comes first and foremost because it's about control. It's about who holds the cards in a game. And until you know that you hold the cards, you can't decide what your next move is. And so sovereignty is always the starting point, and it's an active thing. It continuously has to be lived and fought for and reinvented in every new political age. And because of that, because it means citizens being active and engaged on a political level, but also on a personal level, sovereignty has always been called into question and feared, popular sovereignty, by those in power. So in previous times when priests and popes and kings made the decisions in the land, they feared the idea that the populace of a nation, that the every man and woman would have something to say about what was going on in their nations. And as Lada has already explained, in the not too distant past, rulers have brought in measures in order to quash notions of sovereignty among their citizens violently. And that fear really comes from an idea that if you give power, particularly political power, to you or someone off the street, someone who isn't an academic who has a PhD in front of their name, someone who isn't an expert, someone who doesn't have political power, that all hell will break loose. There's a very negative idea of sovereignty, and particularly popular sovereignty, this idea that how could you trust ordinary citizens to make decisions? Because what do they know? And the outcome is always then, as John was explaining, to remove control and power further and further away from your average citizen, to hide it in supranational organisations, as John was talking about, to sequester it in institutions, which is something we saw very vividly throughout the pandemic, that only certain people in certain qualified positions could make the decisions about what happened to our every movement in our everyday lives. And that fear of sovereignty has, I think, unfortunately, infected a lot of how we think about our place in the political world. So, it's no shame to say that I think lots of us throughout the pandemic, for example, did retreat and did say, oh, well, maybe I don't know if it's the right thing to go for a walk. The most fundamental basic things that you should trust yourself with the ability to make decisions about. You started to question yourself and you started to think, should I really be given that power? And should I really be trusted with those decisions? And so, as John was explaining, sovereignty has become this thing on a national level and also on a popular level and an individual level that is just to be feared. And it makes us lazy because actually what happens is we say, well, I don't have to engage in that because my local politician makes that decision. Or I don't have to think about that decision in my life because I'll just go on NHS or I'll just go on the government website and they'll tell me what to do. And in that way, we become impotent, we become passive, we become people who can't, it's a very frightening thing to suggest that you might have control, because if you have control, then the decision ends and starts with you. You're the one to blame, but also you're the one to praise when things go right. So it's a frightening thing, sovereignty and popular sovereignty. But the reason why I start off by saying it's exciting and why it's the beginning point of any kind of politics is because if you have a sense of, and you have a reality of citizens in a nation being in control of their politics, which post-Brexit in this country we do to a certain degree, certainly more than we did pre-2016, because rather than hiding behind European Union directives or laws made in Strasbourg and Brussels, our politicians now, we can vote them in and out and the buck stops with them. So on that level, but also in a level post-pandemic of a pushback against the kind of restrictive policies that we saw implemented, you have this exciting new opportunity of a spirit of democracy, a spirit of sovereignty coming back into play into politics. And what that means really is that everything is to play for. Everything is possible. Bad, terrible things are possible. People can make wrong decisions. We know that people have made wrong decisions throughout history. But actually, the vast majority of time, if you look at things like national liberation struggles, if you look at civil rights movements, if you take any kind of socially progressive event throughout history, whether it's for gay rights, whether it's for women's liberation, it always has at its core this idea that the individual person and the collective should make the decision for ourselves, that I should be in control over what happens to in my future, and then actually as an extension of that, I should have a say with my fellow citizens of what happens in my nation. And that push for self-control, for popular control, and for sovereignty is, I think, something that we have to be honest with ourselves and say is a challenge. That's why I say it's active. It's something that you take on board as a thing that you will be doing for your whole political life. It's something that you can't ever let slip and you can't ever let someone else make the decision for you. And if you embrace that challenge, then the sky's the limit. Then everything, from kind of how to get something happening in your local area to how to change the government is up for grabs because you're involved in the process. And so I think that, if you understand that what's really a block on sovereignty today is a fear of the pleb, of the everyman, of the unexpert, then what you really realise is that's a bogeyman. It's a fear of nothing. It's a fear of the elites. And we should push back against that. To use that infamous phrase that I think is actually a fantastic phrase from the Brexit campaign that was much maligned, to take back control and actually really mean it, not put it on the side of a bus and use it as a throwaway thing, but genuinely mean it, to take back control of politics, of your own individual sense of self, of sovereignty and your own decisions, then I think the political future, which often can look quite bleak, actually has all the possibilities we want in it.